A whisper at 2 a.m. The phone rings differently at 2 in the morning. You know this if it's ever happened to you. There's a sound a phone makes in the daylight, ordinary, forgettable background noise. And there's a sound it makes in the dead of night, a sound that cuts through sleep like a blade, because some ancient part of your brain already knows. Nobody calls at 2 in the morning with good news. I woke up to that sound on a Tuesday in March, and I remember, even in that first foggy half-second, feeling my heart start pounding before I'd even opened my eyes, because the number on the screen was my grandmother's. My grandmother was 81 years old. She lived alone, 40 minutes away, in the same small house she'd lived in for 50 years. She did not call late. She barely used the phone at all, honestly. She preferred to write things down. Actual paper, actual pen, a habit from another lifetime. So when her name lit up my screen at 2:03 a.m., I answered before I'd even fully processed what was happening. "Grandma?" My voice came out cracked with sleep and fear. "Are you okay?" And there was a silence on the other end. Not dead air. I could hear breathing, careful, shallow breathing, like someone trying very hard not to make a sound. And then she spoke, and she was whispering. My grandmother, who had never once whispered to me in my entire life, who had a voice like a church bell, who filled every room she entered, was whispering into the phone like the walls themselves might be listening. She said, "Don't trust your mother." I sat straight up in bed. "Grandma, what?" "Listen to me," she whispered, and I could hear something in her voice I had never heard from her before. Fear. My grandmother, who was not afraid of anything, who had buried a husband and raised 4 children, and survived things she never fully talked about, my grandmother was afraid. She said, "Check the garage," and then the line went dead. I sat there in the dark, phone still pressed against my ear, listening to a dial tone, and I could not move. I mean that literally. My body simply would not respond. My mind was racing in 100 directions, and my limbs were doing nothing at all. And I sat there, frozen, for what felt like a very long time, staring at nothing, trying to make those 5 words mean something other than what they obviously meant. Don't trust your mother. Check the garage. I called her back immediately. It rang and rang and rang. And then it went to her voicemail, a message she'd recorded years ago, her booming, cheerful voice completely at odds with the whisper I'd just heard, saying she wasn't home right now, but would call back soon. I called again. Same thing. And I sat on the edge of my bed at 2 in the morning, staring at a phone, absolutely frozen, and I want to tell you honestly, I have never in my life felt fear quite like that. Not fear of an intruder, not fear of a monster in the dark, a colder fear. The fear of a sentence that doesn't make sense yet, but that you know, somewhere in your gut, is going to change everything once it does. Don't trust your mother. My mother, the woman who had raised me, the woman I saw every week, the woman who, at that very moment, was probably asleep in her own bed, 4 miles from mine, in the same house I'd grown up in, the house with the garage. And I sat there, frozen, unable to decide what to do, while somewhere out in the dark, my grandmother, who had never been afraid of anything in her whole life, had just, for the first time, been afraid enough to whisper, "Stay with me." Because to understand what was in that garage, and why one phone call at 2 in the morning unraveled something that had been hiding in my family for over a year, you have to understand who my grandmother was, why she would never say something like that lightly, and what it took for me to finally get in my car that night and drive toward an answer I was terrified to find. It starts with the woman who raised half of my childhood and who I trusted more than almost anyone alive, the one who never lied. Let me tell you about my grandmother, because you need to understand something crucial before we go any further. She was not a dramatic woman. I want to be very clear about that. because it matters enormously for what comes later. My grandmother, everyone called her Nana, but I always called her Grandma. Don't ask me why, it just stuck. Was the single most level-headed person I have ever known. She did not exaggerate, she did not gossip, she did not create drama, and she had absolutely no patience for people who did. She'd worked as a nurse for 35 years, back when nursing meant something different than it does now. Long shifts, hard decisions, no room for hysterics. She'd told me once that the job taught her to separate what was actually an emergency from what only felt like one, and that most of life, it turned out, was the second kind. She was also, and I want to stress this, someone who believed deeply in staying out of other people's business. My grandmother did not interfere. She had strong opinions about almost everything, but she kept most of them to herself, because she believed, genuinely believed, that people had to be allowed to live their own lives, make their own mistakes, and figure things out on their own terms. I can count on one hand the number of times, across my entire life, that my grandmother ever told me what to do. Which is exactly why that phone call terrified me the way it did. Because a woman who does not interfere, who does not exaggerate, who spent 35 years learning to tell a real crisis from a false alarm, that woman does not whisper, "Don't trust your mother," into a phone at 2 in the morning, unless something has happened that has genuinely, deeply frightened her. I need to tell you about my relationship with her too, because it's relevant. My parents divorced when I was 6. My father moved across the country not long after, and while he wasn't a villain, we talked on holidays, he sent cards. He wasn't really present in the way a parent needs to be, and my mother worked. She worked constantly, 2 jobs for years, trying to keep us afloat as a single parent, and I don't blame her for that, not for a second. But it meant that a huge amount of my actual raising fell to my grandmother. I spent every day after school at her house until I was old enough to be alone. I spent most weekends there. She taught me to cook, to garden, to fix a leaking faucet, to balance a checkbook back before anyone did that on a phone. She was there for every school play, every awkward teenage crisis, every heartbreak. My grandmother did not just love me. She knew me, in the specific, granular way that only comes from actual sustained presence, and I knew her the same way. And in 81 years of life, I had never once heard fear in her voice. Until that call. So when I sat there at 2 in the morning, staring at a dead phone, unable to move, it wasn't because I thought my grandmother had lost her mind, or gotten confused, or was playing some strange joke. It was because I knew, with a terrible certainty, that if she was afraid, actually afraid, whispering in the dark afraid, then whatever was happening was real. And I had to go find out what it was. The picture I thought I had. Before I tell you what I found, I need to give you the picture of my family as I understood it before that phone call. Because the gap between what I believed and what turned out to be true is the whole heart of this story. I was 29 years old. I had my own apartment, my own job, my own life, but I was still close with my mother, closer, honestly, than a lot of people my age are with their parents. We talked most days. I had dinner at her house at least once a week. I trusted her completely. My mother, Diane, had remarried about 18 months before that night. His name was Richard. And I want to be honest, I had never fully warmed to Richard, but I couldn't have told you exactly why. He was polite, he was successful, or seemed to be. He talked a lot about a business he ran, something in imports, though the specifics were always a little hazy whenever I asked. He was attentive to my mother in a way that seemed genuine. He remembered my birthday. He tried, in his slightly overeager way, to build a relationship with me. But something about him had always sat slightly wrong with me. Nothing I could name. Just a low hum of unease that I chalked up to the normal awkwardness of a parent's new partner, and which I mostly kept to myself, because my mother was happy, genuinely, visibly happier than I'd seen her in years, and I didn't want to be the difficult adult child who couldn't be glad for her. My grandmother, I should tell you, had never fully warmed to Richard either, but she'd never said anything critical. She was polite to him at family gatherings, cordial, correct. She simply watched him. I'd noticed that, actually, now that I think back on it. At holidays, my grandmother's eyes would follow Richard around a room in a way that seemed almost clinical, assessing. I never thought much of it. My grandmother assessed everyone. It was just who she was. My mother and Richard lived in the house I'd grown up in, the same house, though it had been extensively renovated after they married. New kitchen, new everything, really. Richard had money, or access to money, and he'd insisted on the renovations almost as soon as he moved in, which my mother had been thrilled about, because she'd wanted to update that house for years and had never had the money to do it herself. The garage was part of that renovation. It had always been my mother's, a normal two-car garage where she kept her car and a lot of accumulated household junk. After Richard moved in, it had slowly, quietly, become his. He'd had it insulated, he said, for a workshop. He'd put in a heavy new door with a keypad lock, which struck me at the time as excessive for a suburban garage, but he'd explained it as protecting his tools, and I'd let it go. My mother, when I asked her about it once, laughed and said, "Oh, that's Richard's space. I don't even go in there anymore, honestly. He's very particular about his tools. I don't even go in there anymore." I hadn't thought anything of that sentence when she said it. It seemed like an ordinary marital arrangement. Everybody's got a room, a space, a thing they're territorial about. Sitting on the edge of my bed at 2 a.m, though, that sentence came back to me with a completely different weight. My mother didn't go in the garage. My grandmother had told me to check it. And somewhere out there in the dark, this quiet, level-headed woman who never interfered, who had watched Richard with clinical, careful eyes for 18 months, had finally, urgently, at the cost of her own safety, decided that I needed to know something. I got out of bed, I got dressed with hands that were shaking, and I drove, not to my mother's house, not yet. I drove to my grandmother's. 40 minutes of every worst possibility. I want to tell you about that drive, because it is genuinely one of the longest 40 minutes of my life, and I've thought about it every day since. I called her the whole way, on speaker, every few minutes. Voicemail, voicemail, and with every unanswered ring, my mind constructed a new, worse scenario. Had someone hurt her? Had she been discovered, mid-call, by whoever she was hiding from? Was the whisper because there was someone in the house with her? Someone who couldn't hear her talking? I want to be honest about the state I was in. I was not thinking clearly. I was driving too fast on empty roads, running a stop sign I don't even remember approaching, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, replaying 5 words over and over in my head like a scratched record. Don't trust your mother. Check the garage. I tried to make sense of it rationally, because that's what I do. I'm a rational person. Or I like to think I am. I tried to construct innocent explanations. Maybe Grandma had a nightmare and gotten confused, half asleep, and called me in a fog. Maybe she'd misheard something, or misunderstood something, and her mind, 81 years old, and I loved her, but 81 is 81. Maybe her mind had simply played a trick on her. But every time I tried to talk myself into that comforting story, I ran into the same wall. My grandmother was sharp, sharper than most people half her age. She still did the crossword every day, in pen, and finished it. She still managed her own finances, her own medications, her own life, with total competence. There was no fog in that woman's mind. There never had been. And a person in a fog does not whisper. A person in a fog does not choose their words with the precision of, "Don't trust your mother, check the garage." 5 words, perfectly economical, containing an accusation and a piece of evidence, delivered in the time it takes to breathe twice. That was not confusion. That was someone giving me exactly the information I needed, as fast as possible, before something stopped her from giving me any more. By the time I turned onto her street, I had genuinely convinced myself I was about to find something terrible: an ambulance, police lights, the worst thing. Her street was quiet, dark, ordinary. Her porch light was on, the way it always was. I pulled into her driveway so fast I nearly hit the mailbox, and I was out of the car and up the front steps before I'd even turned off the engine properly, and I pounded on that door with both fists, shouting her name into the dark, absolutely certain, in that moment, that I was about to find the worst thing I had ever seen. And then, through the door, I heard footsteps. Slow, careful, hers. And the door opened, and my grandmother, small, silver-haired, wrapped in her old blue robe, very much alive, very much unharmed, stood there looking at me with an expression I will never, ever forget. Not fear anymore. Relief. And underneath the relief, something heavier. Resolve. 18 months of watching. She pulled me inside and locked the door behind us. 3 locks, I noticed, where I only remembered one, and she sat me down at her kitchen table, the same table I'd done 1,000 homework assignments at as a kid, and she made tea with hands that were not quite steady, and then she told me everything. I'm going to give you the shape of it now, as she gave it to me that night, because it took nearly an hour, and I don't think I've ever listened that hard to anything in my life. She started with an apology, which surprised me. She said, "I should have told you sooner. I've been trying to be sure. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, because if I was wrong, I could have destroyed your relationship with your mother for nothing. And now I'm afraid I waited too long, and I'm sorry for that." And then she told me about Richard. She said that from the very first time she met him, something had felt wrong. Not obviously wrong. She was careful to say that. He was charming. He said the right things. But she'd spent 35 years as a nurse, learning to read people in crisis, learning the difference between someone telling the truth and someone performing the truth, and something about the way Richard talked about his business had never sat right with her. "He talks about money like a man who's used to having it," she said, "but he talks about earning it like a man who's never actually done that. There's a difference. I couldn't have told you what it was. At first, I just felt it. The story never quite added up, and I've learned, at my age, to trust that feeling more than I used to." So, quietly, over 18 months, she'd started paying attention. She noticed that Richard's import business had no clear clients that anyone could name. She noticed that when she asked him direct questions about it, gently, the way an old woman can get away with asking nosy questions, his answers were smooth but strangely vague, full of impressive-sounding words that somehow never added up to actual information. She noticed that despite claiming a successful business, Richard seemed to move money strangely. Large cash withdrawals, a safe he'd installed in the newly renovated house, the garage, locked, keypad secured, off limits even to my mother, for a man who claimed it was simply his workshop. And she noticed, most alarmingly, a change in my mother. "Your mother has always been a private person about money," my grandmother told me. "But since Richard, she's stopped talking about it at all, any of it. And a few months ago, I asked her, just casually, how retirement savings were going, and she got strange. Evasive, almost frightened. Your mother has never once in her life looked frightened when I asked her a simple question. That's when I knew something was actually wrong, not just odd. Then she told me about 3 weeks earlier, the night everything changed. She'd come to visit unannounced, something she did occasionally, dropping by with a casserole, using her spare key when no one answered the door. and she'd let herself in through the side entrance, near the garage, and she'd heard voices, Richard's voice, and another man's voice she didn't recognize. And through the door, the heavy, insulated, keypad-locked door, she'd heard, faintly, words she was not meant to hear. Words like shipment, words like before the deadline, words like if she finds out, we're finished. If she finds out. She had not gone in. She'd been too frightened, she admitted to me, ashamed of the fear. This woman who had never been ashamed of anything. She'd quietly left before anyone knew she'd been there. And for 3 weeks, she had agonized over what to do, whether to tell my mother directly and risk being wrong, risk destroying a marriage over a misunderstanding, whether to investigate further herself, whether to tell me and put that burden on someone so much younger. And then, that night, the night she called me, something had happened that finally tipped her over the edge. She had seen a car in the driveway at midnight, men she didn't recognize, moving boxes into the garage under cover of darkness, while my mother's bedroom light stayed off, as if she were asleep, uninvolved, unaware. And my grandmother, watching from her own car parked down the street, because she had, by that point, taken to quietly watching the house some nights, worried and unable to stop herself, had finally understood that whatever was happening, it was serious, it was active, and it could not wait any longer. So she'd called me, whispering because she didn't know if the phone itself could somehow be compromised, if that makes any sense. She admitted it might have been paranoia, but by that point, she said, she genuinely no longer knew what was and wasn't possible. I don't know what's in that garage, my grandmother told me, gripping my hand across the kitchen table. I don't know exactly what he's doing, but I know it's illegal, and I know it's dangerous, and I am terrified that your mother is either lying to protect him, or she genuinely doesn't know, and either way, sweetheart, I need you to be very, very careful about what you do next. What do I do with this? I sat in my grandmother's kitchen as the sun started to come up, and I felt something I can only describe as the ground shifting permanently beneath me. Because here is the impossible position I found myself in. If my grandmother was right, and everything about her, everything I knew of her character, told me she was, then my mother was either a victim or, in some way I didn't want to think about, involved, and I did not know which, and there was no way to know without finding out more, and every path toward finding out more felt dangerous. If I went straight to my mother and told her everything, what if Richard was there? What if he overheard? What if my mother, frightened or protective, or simply in denial, told him everything I'd said, and he did something to cover his tracks, or worse, did something to protect himself from 2 women who now knew too much? If I went to the police with what I had, which was, when I really looked at it, secondhand information about an overheard conversation and some boxes moved at midnight, would they even take it seriously? Or would I set off an investigation that blew up my mother's marriage and possibly her safety, based on evidence that might, in the end, turn out to be nothing? And underneath all of that practical calculation was something else, something that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with grief. Because some part of me, the daughter part, the part that had trusted my mother completely for 29 years, was sitting in that kitchen quietly falling apart, even entertaining the possibility that my mother might be involved in something illegal, might be lying to me, might be a stranger wearing a familiar face. That possibility alone was its own kind of loss, even if it turned out to be nothing, even if my mother was completely innocent. The fact that I now had to wonder had already taken something from me that I wasn't going to get back. My grandmother watched me work through all of this, and she said something I have carried with me ever since. She said, "I know this is unbearable. I know I've just handed you a burden I couldn't carry alone. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to hold on to it, whatever happens next. Whatever your mother has or hasn't done, whatever we find, none of it is your fault, and none of it changes who you are. You didn't create this, you just happened to be the one who had to find out about it. And then she said the thing that finally gave me a plan. She said, "We don't act on fear, we act on facts. And right now, we don't have facts. We have a feeling, and an overheard conversation, and some boxes in the night. Before we blow up anyone's life, including your mother's, if she's innocent, we need to actually know what's in that garage." "How do we find that out?" I asked. And my grandmother, 81 years old, terrified, and somehow, in that moment, more clear-eyed than I had ever seen her, looked at me and said, "You're going to have to go look." Getting into the garage, I want to be honest with you about the next few days, because they were some of the strangest, most tense days of my entire life. Days spent going through the motions of an ordinary week, while carrying a secret that felt like it might crack me open at any moment. I saw my mother twice that week. Sunday dinner, as usual, a quick coffee on Wednesday, and both times I sat across from this woman I had loved my entire life, searching her face for something, guilt, fear, deception, anything, and finding nothing but the same warm, familiar mother I'd always known. That was almost worse than finding something would have been. Because either she was an extraordinary actress, and my mother had never, in 29 years, shown any sign of being able to lie convincingly about anything. She was famously, almost comically bad at hiding surprises and secrets. Or she genuinely did not know what was happening 18 feet from where she slept every night. My grandmother and I spoke every day that week, always carefully, always assuming the worst about who might overhear. And together, we built a plan. A careful one, because my grandmother's rule held firm. We act on facts, not fear. The opportunity came on Saturday. My mother mentioned, over that Wednesday coffee, that she and Richard were going to a work dinner that weekend. One of his associates, she said, someone important to the business. She'd been looking forward to it, actually, a rare evening out. She mentioned they'd be gone from 6 until at least 11. I knew, hearing that this was the chance my grandmother had been waiting for. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters. I did not consider, for 1 second, breaking in. I am not that person, and more importantly, I understood, even in the grip of all that fear and confusion, that anything I found through an illegal entry would be useless, worse than useless, because it could actually undermine any real investigation later, if it came to that. So instead, we did something smaller and smarter. My mother, it turned out, had a spare garage remote in her kitchen drawer, one she'd never used, since Richard had installed the keypad and mostly used that instead, but the remote for the old system had never been removed. She'd mentioned it once, in passing, months earlier, complaining that Richard had never shown her the new keypad code, and she'd felt a little shut out of her own garage. I remembered that comment. It had seemed like nothing at the time. Now it was the key to everything. On Saturday, while my mother and Richard were at dinner, I went to visit her, using the spare key I'd always had, which Richard, apparently, either didn't know about or hadn't thought to change. I was not planning to search the garage myself. I want to stress this. My grandmother and I had agreed I would go in only far enough to see, with my own eyes, whether there was anything visibly, obviously wrong, anything that would tell us whether to go to the police that same night, or whether to keep gathering information more carefully. I found the old remote in the kitchen drawer exactly where my mother had mentioned it, and I stood at the door connecting the house to the garage, remote in a shaking hand, and I pressed the button, and the door began, slowly, to rise. Not what either of us expected. I want to tell you what I found, and I want to tell you honestly that it was not what my grandmother feared, and it was not what I feared either. It was worse, in a completely different way, and also, eventually, so much better. The garage had been transformed. It was no longer a place for cars or tools. It had been converted into something closer to an office, a proper one, with a desk, filing cabinets, a computer setup, and along one wall, stacked neatly, a series of sealed cardboard boxes. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I stepped inside, phone held up, recording. My hands shaking so badly the video is nearly unwatchable when I look back at it now. I opened one of the boxes, and inside were documents, stacks and stacks of paper, folders, financial statements, property records, names I didn't recognize. I sat down at the desk. I shouldn't have, I know, but my legs simply gave out, and I started going through what was there as fast as I could, terrified of running out of time. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture started to form. And it was not the picture I'd braced myself for. Richard was not smuggling anything. There was no shipment of anything illegal. What I found, spread across that desk and those boxes, was a paper trail of fraud, but not the kind involving drugs or weapons or anything cinematic. It was financial fraud, investment fraud specifically. Richard had, it turned out, been running a scheme for years, soliciting money from investors, mostly older people, mostly people he met through a network of business associates, promising returns on investments that didn't actually exist. Classic structure, I'd learn later, once actual investigators explained it to me. New investors' money paying off old investors, an unsustainable pyramid that required constant new victims to keep from collapsing. And here was the part that made my blood run cold. My mother's name was on documents in that office, multiple documents, her signature, on paperwork for accounts, for transfers, for investments, and her name, listed alongside Richard's, on nearly everything. For one horrible, dizzying minute, sitting at that desk, I believed my grandmother's worst fear had come true. I believed my mother was involved, a partner in whatever this was. And then I looked closer, and I understood something that changed the entire shape of the story. My mother wasn't a partner. My mother was a target. My mother didn't know she was the victim. I need to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that matters most, and I want to get it exactly right. As I went through those documents, faster now, understanding growing with every page, I realized that a significant portion of what Richard had been doing involved my mother's own retirement savings and, more specifically, her portion of my late grandfather's estate, which had come to her years before Richard ever entered the picture. Richard had married my mother 18 months earlier, and in that time, gradually, carefully, using the kind of patient manipulation that takes real skill and real coldness, he had convinced her to move money, small amounts at first, into joint investment opportunities, then larger amounts. He'd used the language of partnership, of building a future together, of trust. And my mother, who loved him, who was happier than she'd been in years, who wanted so badly to believe in this second chance at love, my mother had signed what he put in front of her, not because she understood what she was signing, because she trusted him, the way you trust someone you love, and he had spent 18 months carefully, deliberately, earning a trust he intended to exploit completely. If she finds out, we're finished, that my grandmother had overheard. I understood it now. It hadn't been about hiding an operation from law enforcement, primarily. It had been about hiding it from my mother herself, because the entire scheme depended on her not understanding what she'd actually signed, what had actually happened to my grandfather's money, what Richard was actually doing with funds that were, on paper, jointly hers. She wasn't his accomplice. She was his biggest asset, his way in. A woman with real money, real trust, and real love for him. The perfect cover, and the perfect source. I sat in that garage-turned-office, surrounded by evidence of a betrayal so much larger and colder than anything I'd imagined, and I understood, all at once, why my grandmother had been so afraid, and why she'd been so careful, and why she'd said, "Don't trust your mother," instead of something clearer. Because in that moment, on the phone, at 2 in the morning, my grandmother genuinely hadn't known which version of the truth we were about to find. She hadn't known if she was warning me about my mother or warning me for my mother. She'd given me the only thing she had, a warning and a location, and trusted me to find the rest. And what I'd found was that the woman I loved, the woman who'd raised me, was not a criminal. She was being robbed, in slow motion, by a man who had married her specifically to do it, and she had no idea. I photographed everything I could, as fast as I could. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I closed the garage door, and I left, my whole body shaking, and I drove straight to my grandmother's house, and I told her everything. And my grandmother, 81 years old, having spent 3 weeks afraid that her own daughter might be a criminal, put her head down on that kitchen table and wept with something that was, impossibly, relief. Because the truth, however terrible, was so much better than the fear. Our mother, our daughter, was innocent. She was just in danger, bringing it into the light, carefully. Here is where I have to tell you that we did not handle this like people in a movie. We did not confront Richard ourselves, dramatically, in some big scene. We did something slower, more careful, and, I believe, much smarter. My grandmother and I spent that Sunday, the day after I found the documents, deciding on the right path, and we agreed on something crucial. My mother needed to hear this from people who loved her before anyone else got involved, because whatever came next was going to be one of the hardest days of her life, and she deserved to hear it with family beside her, not from a police officer at her door. So on Monday morning, we went to her together. Not Richard's house. Richard was at work, whatever that actually meant. We went to my mother, alone, and we sat her down, and my grandmother held her hand, and I laid out, as gently and clearly as I could, everything we'd found. I want to tell you honestly, it was one of the worst hours of my life. Watching my mother's face as the truth landed, I watched her go through disbelief, then anger at us, at first, for accusing him, for going into that garage, for even suggesting it. And then, as I showed her the photographs, the documents, her own signature on things she didn't remember signing, or remembered signing, under vague, rushed circumstances she'd never questioned, I watched the anger turn to something else. I watched her realize. I watched a woman I loved understand, in real time, that the second chance at happiness she'd been so grateful for had been a costume worn by someone hunting her. She cried in a way I had never seen her cry. Not pretty, not composed, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere below grief, somewhere close to the loss of your own ability to trust your own judgment. And my grandmother held her, and I held both of them, and we sat like that for a long time, the three of us, in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, while somewhere across town, a man who thought he'd gotten away with something had no idea his entire scheme was already unraveling. We went to the authorities the next day, together, with copies of everything I'd photographed, with my mother's own testimony, with my grandmother's account of the overheard conversation. It turned out, and this took months to fully unfold, that Richard had done this before, more than once, different name, in one prior instance, other victims, in other cities, who had never been able to piece together what happened to them, because he was careful, and patient, and good at what he did. My mother's willingness to come forward, to hand over everything, to testify to what she'd seen and signed, It became the thing that finally let investigators build a real case, not just against him, but connecting him to a pattern investigators had been trying to prove for years. Richard was arrested about 6 weeks after that night in the garage. I won't go into all the legal details, because they're long and complicated and honestly, a little boring compared to everything else. But the short version is, he is not a free man anymore, and he will not be for a long time. My mother did not get all of her money back. I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't a story where everything is magically restored. Some of it was recovered. A significant amount was not. She had to start over, in her 50s, in ways she never expected to. But she started over as herself, awake, aware, not asleep in a house while men moved boxes past her bedroom window in the dark, the whisper that saved us. So let me tell you what all of this taught me, because if you've stayed with me this whole way, some of this belongs to you now. The first thing I learned is this: trust your gut, even when you can't explain it. And trust other people's guts too, especially the quiet ones. My grandmother could not, for a long time, put into words exactly what was wrong with Richard. It was a feeling, an instinct, built from 35 years of reading people at their most vulnerable and most dishonest. And it would have been easy, so easy, to dismiss that feeling as an old woman being difficult, or overprotective, or paranoid about her daughter's new husband. If she'd dismissed her own instinct, or if I had dismissed her warning, my mother might still be sitting in that house today, slowly losing everything to a man wearing the face of love. Instincts are not proof, but they are data. And when the person having the instinct is someone who has spent a lifetime being right about people, that data deserves to be taken seriously. The second thing I learned is this: the scariest information is not always the truest one, and panic makes terrible decisions. For those first hours, I believed, genuinely believed, that my mother might be a willing participant in something criminal. And if I had acted on that fear immediately, if I had confronted her in anger, or gone straight to the police with accusations instead of facts, I could have destroyed my relationship with her, and worse, I could have tipped off Richard before we had any real evidence, giving him time to disappear, or destroy the documents, or hurt someone. My grandmother's insistence on facts over fear, slow down, verify, don't blow up a life on a feeling, however strong, was the single most important decision in this entire story. Fear feels urgent. It rarely is, in the way it insists it is. Facts take longer to gather, and they are almost always worth the wait. The third thing, and this is the one I think about most, being deceived does not make you foolish, and it does not make you complicit. For a long time after all this, my mother struggled with a kind of shame that had nothing to do with anything she'd actually done wrong. She kept asking how she could have been so blind, so stupid, so easily fooled. And I want to say to anyone listening who has been through something similar, being the target of a patient, skilled manipulator is not a character flaw. These people study exactly how to earn trust, exactly which words unlock which fears and hopes, exactly how to move slowly enough that nothing ever feels like a red flag until it's much too late. My mother wasn't foolish. She was targeted by someone whose entire skill set was built around exploiting the very best parts of her capacity to love, to trust, to believe in a second chance. Don't let anyone, including yourself, turn a victim into a fool. And the last thing, the thing I hold on to most. Sometimes the people who love us quietly, without ever making a scene, are the ones watching most carefully, and when they finally break their silence, you need to listen. My grandmother did not interfere for 18 months. She watched, she waited, she gathered what she could, quietly, at real risk to herself, because she loved my mother too much to accuse a man on nothing but a feeling, and because she loved me too much to hand me a burden before she was as certain as she could possibly be. And when she finally broke that silence, at 2 in the morning, whispering, terrified, it was not drama, it was the most important 5 words anyone has ever said to me. Don't trust your mother. Check the garage. She was wrong about exactly one thing that night. It was not my mother we couldn't trust. It was the man standing next to her, smiling, in a garage full of other people's stolen futures. But my grandmother was right about everything else. Right to be afraid, right to whisper, right to trust me with the truth before she had all of it, because she knew, in the end, that a family that faces the truth together, even a terrifying, half-formed 3 in the morning truth, is stronger than a family that stays comfortable inside a lie. She called me because she trusted me to handle what she couldn't handle alone. I hope, for the rest of my life, I am worthy of that trust. If someone in your life has ever given you a warning that seemed too strange, too sudden, too frightening to be real, I hope this story reminds you of something important. The people who love us quietly are often the ones seeing the most clearly. Don't dismiss the whisper. Follow it carefully. Gather the facts. Protect the people you love, but follow it. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people in your life who watch quietly and rarely speak up. When they finally do, it usually means it matters more than anything else they could say.